December 2nd, 1972, 23,000 feet above the Red River Valley in North Vietnam. Captain Steve Ritchie locked eyes on the silver dart climbing toward him through the haze, a MiG-21 fishbed flown by one of North Vietnam's most experienced pilots. The North Vietnamese Air Force had spent months studying American tactics, learning American patterns, waiting for moments exactly like this. Their Soviet instructors had told them the F-4 Phantom was a flawed design, a compromised aircraft built by a committee that didn't understand real air combat. It was too heavy, they said, too dependent on missiles that failed half the time. It had no gun, no cannon for close-in fighting, which meant American pilots were flying into battle with one hand tied behind their backs. The Vietnamese pilots called it the refrigerator with wings because of its bulky fuselage and massive engines. They laughed at intelligence reports showing F-4 production numbers, convinced that American industrial might had produced a monster that looked fearsome on paper but would fall apart when the real shooting started. But what those MiG pilots didn't know, what their instructors in Moscow had failed to understand, was that the Phantom wasn't designed to fight the war they expected. It was designed to fight every war simultaneously, to perform missions no single aircraft had ever attempted, to carry more weapons farther and faster than anything else in the sky. The men who flew it had learned to turn its massive power and devastating speed into advantages that no amount of Soviet tactical training could overcome. Within 90 seconds, Captain Ritchie would add his 5th confirmed kill and become the first United States Air Force ace of the Vietnam War, proving once again that American pilots and American aircraft could dominate any sky on Earth when the mission demanded it. The story of the F-4 Phantom begins not with a single brilliant idea, but with a stubborn refusal to accept the limitations everyone else considered inevitable. In 1953, McDonnell Aircraft Corporation was building reliable but unremarkable fighters for the Navy, solid workhorses that did their jobs without breaking new ground. But the chief engineer, a man named Herman Barkey, had been studying combat reports from Korea, and he'd noticed something troubling. American pilots were flying 3 or 4 different aircraft types to accomplish missions that future wars would demand happen simultaneously. You needed a fighter for air superiority, an attack bomber for ground targets, an interceptor for fleet defense, and a reconnaissance platform for intelligence gathering. Barkey gathered his team and asked a question that seemed almost ridiculous at the time. What if one aircraft could do all of it? Not compromise solutions where you gave up performance in one area to gain capability in another, but genuine multi-role dominance where the same airframe excelled at everything. His colleagues thought he'd lost his mind because the physics seemed impossible. An aircraft optimized for high-speed interception would be too heavy for dogfighting, too specialized for ground attack, too complex for carrier operations. But Barkey had noticed something else in those Korean War reports, something that would change fighter design forever. Battles were no longer won by aircraft that could turn tighter or climb faster in isolation. They were won by systems, by aircraft that could detect enemies first, engage from longer ranges, carry more weapons, and survive more damage. The age of the gunslinging dogfighter turning inside his opponent at close range was giving way to an era of radar-guided missiles, electronic warfare, and coordinated strikes, where information and firepower mattered more than raw maneuverability. So McDonnell designed the Phantom around 2 massive General Electric J-79 engines that together produced more than 35,000 pounds of thrust, more raw power than any fighter in history. They built it big, nearly 63 feet long with a wingspan of 38 feet, because size meant fuel capacity, weapons payload, and space for the radar and electronics that would give it an overwhelming advantage in detection and targeting. Then they did something that would prove brilliant in practice, even though it looked insane on paper. They designed it to carry up to 18,000 pounds of weapons, more than a World War II B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bomber, on 9 external hardpoints that could be configured for air-to-air missiles, bombs, rockets, fuel tanks, or electronic warfare pods depending on the mission. The Navy looked at the prototype and saw something they'd never dared hope for, a fleet defender that could intercept Soviet bombers at long range, a strike fighter that could deliver nuclear weapons, and an air superiority fighter that could tangle with anything the enemy put in the sky. They ordered it into production in 1958, and by 1960 the first F-4 Phantoms were reaching operational squadrons. But the real validation came when the Air Force, which had initially dismissed the Phantom as a Navy design too specialized for land-based operations, took a closer look at what it could actually do. They ran tests comparing it to their own fighters, and the results were shocking. The Phantom could outrun, outclimb, and outfight everything America had in service. It could carry more bombs farther than dedicated attack aircraft, while still maintaining the performance to defend itself against enemy fighters. In 1963, the Air Force swallowed its pride and ordered Phantoms of their own, making it the first aircraft in history to serve as the primary fighter for both the Navy and Air Force simultaneously. Production lines in St. Louis began running 3 shifts, 7 days a week, because suddenly everyone wanted the refrigerator with wings. The Phantom arrived in Vietnam in 1965, carrying the confidence of a technological revolution and the burden of untested theories about how modern air combat would unfold. Air Force and Navy strategists had convinced themselves that dogfighting was obsolete, that future battles would be decided by radar operators guiding missiles from beyond visual range, that guns were relics of a primitive age that had ended with Korea. So they sent the Phantom to war without an internal cannon, armed instead with AM-7 Sparrow and AM-9 Sidewinder missiles that were supposed to kill enemy aircraft from miles away before any turning fight could develop. The North Vietnamese Air Force, flying Soviet-supplied MiG-17s and MiG-21s, had other plans. They understood their aircraft were slower, less powerful, and less sophisticated than the Phantom, so they developed tactics that turned those disadvantages into bait for a trap. MiG pilots would refuse long-range engagements, dodging missiles and forcing Phantoms into close-quarters turning fights where the American advantage in speed and weapons load became irrelevant. Then came the rules of engagement that handed North Vietnam an even bigger gift. American pilots were required to visually identify enemy aircraft before firing, which meant closing to ranges where the Phantom's radar and missile advantage disappeared and the MiG's superior low-speed maneuverability took over. But American pilots adapt, and the men flying Phantoms over North Vietnam began developing tactics that played to their aircraft's brutal strengths rather than fighting the war their opponents wanted. They learned to use the Phantom's overwhelming speed as both sword and shield, accelerating to supersonic velocity to dictate when fights happened, and escaping when the geometry turned unfavorable. They discovered that the massive engines and raw power meant they could climb faster and higher than any MiG. So they started fights from above, diving through enemy formations with energy the Vietnamese pilots couldn't match. Navy pilot Lieutenant Randy Cunningham figured out that you could use the Phantom's superior roll rate to offset the MiG's tighter turning radius. Instead of trying to turn with a MiG in a sustained circle, which would always end badly, you rolled into a vertical scissors maneuver, trading altitude for position while keeping your speed up, forcing the lighter MiG to burn energy, trying to track you through three-dimensional space. On May 10, 1972, Cunningham and his radar intercept officer Willie Driscoll put these tactics to ultimate test against a North Vietnamese pilot intelligence would later identify as Colonel Toon, a veteran with 9 confirmed kills who knew every trick in the book. The fight started at 18,000 feet when Cunningham spotted 3 MiG-17s stalking a strike package he was escorting. He accelerated to attack speed and fired a sidewinder that one MiG dodged, but the maneuver bled off the enemy's speed and gave Cunningham position for a second shot that connected, blowing the MiG's tail off. The remaining 2 enemy fighters dove for the deck, trying to escape in a ground clutter where American radar couldn't track them. But Cunningham followed them down, trusting his speed to get him out if the situation deteriorated. That's when Colonel Toon appeared, pulling his MiG-17 into a vertical climb that should have been impossible given the aircraft's power-to-weight ratio. The Vietnamese ace was deliberately stalling his aircraft, hanging on his propeller, betting that Cunningham would overshoot and give him a gun solution. Instead, Cunningham chopped his throttles, extended his speed brakes, and used the Phantom's superior thrust to hold position below the MiG, waiting for gravity to do what Toone's engine couldn't. The instant the MiG-17 fell nose down, Cunningham fired his last Sidewinder from less than 300 feet. The missile barely had time to arm before it struck Toone's aircraft and sent it tumbling into the jungle below. Cunningham and Driscoll became the Navy's first aces of Vietnam that day, and they'd done it by refusing to fight the Phantom's war the way anyone expected. What transformed the Phantom from a controversial design into an indispensable weapon was its ability to carry the war to the enemy in ways no other aircraft could match. When Air Force planners needed to strike the Paul Doumer Bridge in Hanoi, a critical link in North Vietnam's supply network that had survived multiple bombing attempts, they turned to Phantoms carrying laser-guided paveway bombs that could hit a target the size of a truck from 20,000 feet. When Navy strike packages needed protection from surface-to-air missiles, F-4s equipped with Wild Weasel jamming pods and anti-radiation missiles flew ahead of the formation, hunting down and destroying missile sites before they could lock onto the bombers following behind. When intelligence reported enemy troop concentrations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Phantoms appeared overhead carrying combinations of cluster bombs, napalm, and high-explosive ordnance that could devastate an area the size of 10 football fields in a single pass. The aircraft that North Vietnamese pilots mocked as too heavy and too specialized was simultaneously flying combat air patrols, close air support missions, strategic bombing runs, reconnaissance flights, and electronic warfare sorties, sometimes on the same day, often with the same airframes. The maintenance crews who kept Phantoms flying tell stories that reveal the aircraft's brutal reliability under conditions that would have grounded lesser designs. At Da Nang Air Base in 1968, crew chiefs were turning around F-4s in under 45 minutes, which meant landing, refueling, rearming with 6,000 pounds of ordnance, inspecting for battle damage, and launching again before the pilots had finished debriefing from their previous mission. One aircraft, an F-4C with the tail number 64-0829, flew 7 combat sorties in a single day, alternating between MiG patrols over Hanoi and close air support missions near Khe Sanh, accumulating 11 flight hours without anything more than fuel, weapons, and a quick visual inspection between launches. Another Phantom took a 37mm anti-aircraft round through the left engine that should have ended the mission instantly, but the J-79 kept producing partial thrust, enough to get the crew back to friendly territory where they ejected safely and watched their aircraft glide another 12 miles before finally crashing into the jungle. Pilots started calling it the world's fastest helicopter because it could fly home on one engine, could absorb battle damage that would destroy other fighters, could land with missing control surfaces and bent airframes, and be flying again within days. What the North Vietnamese never quite understood, what Soviet tactical doctrine hadn't prepared them for, was that American industrial capacity wasn't just producing Phantoms in large numbers. It was producing them with enough margin in every system that battle damage, which would be catastrophic in a Soviet aircraft, was merely inconvenient in an F-4. The engines had thrust reserves that meant losing 30% power still left you faster than most enemy fighters. The hydraulic systems were triple redundant, so you could lose 2 of 3 systems and still maintain control. The fuel tanks were self-sealing and positioned to maximize survivability, which meant even significant hits often left you with enough fuel to reach a tanker or a friendly airfield. One Phantom returned to base with over 240 holes from ground fire, including damage to the tail, both wings, and one engine, yet the pilot described the landing as routine, nothing more exciting than a normal day at the office. By 1972, North Vietnamese Air Force intelligence had stopped briefing pilots that the Phantom was vulnerable or poorly designed because too many good men had died learning otherwise. Instead, they started briefing survival tactics, how to avoid engagement, how to escape if bounced, how to recognize when a Phantom crew had position and energy enough to make the fight unwinnable. The aircraft that arrived in Southeast Asia, carrying untested theories, had become the measuring stick by which all other fighters would be judged. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Phantom service in Vietnam was how American pilots turned its supposed weakness, the lack of an internal gun, into a demonstration of adaptability that would reshape fighter tactics for the next generation. By 1967, Air Force crews were mounting the SUU, 23-gun pod on the centerline hardpoint, a 20mm Gatling cannon with 1,200 rounds that added close-range lethality without requiring a complete redesign. But something interesting happened when pilots started using it in combat. They discovered that the gun pod, which engineers thought would be essential for dogfighting, was actually most effective for ground attack and strafing runs, while air-to-air kills still came primarily from missiles once crews learned the weapon's limitations and employment envelopes. Captain John Madden, flying out of Euban Royal Thai Air Force Base, put it perfectly when he said the gun made him feel better, but the missiles made him effective because a Sidewinder fired from the right position with the right geometry killed just as reliably as a cannon, but did it from ranges where the enemy couldn't shoot back. The real revolution came from weapons system officers, the backseaters who operated the radar and managed the sensors while pilots flew the aircraft. These men, often overlooked in the glamorous narratives about fighter aces and dogfighting, were the ones who transformed the Phantom from a fast truck carrying missiles into a precision instrument of air superiority. Captain Charles de Bellevue, who would become the highest-scoring American ace of Vietnam with 6 confirmed kills, revolutionized radar intercept techniques by developing a method for tracking multiple targets simultaneously while guiding his pilot into firing position against the highest priority threat. He understood that the Phantom's APQ-120 radar could detect MiGs at ranges beyond 40 miles under the right conditions, which meant proper radar work gave American crews 5 to 10 minutes of decision-making time, while North Vietnamese pilots were still flying blind, unaware they were being hunted. De Bellevue would vector his pilot, Captain Steve Ritchie, into attack positions that guaranteed first-shot opportunities, and he did it so consistently that other crews started studying his techniques, trying to understand how he achieved lock-on percentages that shouldn't have been possible given the equipment's documented limitations. What separated great Phantom crews from average ones wasn't stick and rudder skills or even raw courage, though both mattered. It was the seamless coordination between pilot and weapons system officer, the kind of trust that only develops when 2 men fly together through situations where mistakes mean death. Major Robert Lodge and Captain Roger Locker were flying as a team when they engaged a formation of 4 MiG-21s on May 10, 1972, the same day Cunningham and Driscoll made ace. Lodge had position and altitude advantage, with the MiGs below him unaware they'd been detected. Locker called out range, closure rate, and target priority while Lodge maneuvered for a sparrow shot that struck the lead MiG and sent it spinning into the ground. The remaining 3 MiGs scattered, trying to escape, but Lodge stayed calm, trusting Locker to sort the geometry while he focused on flying the aircraft. They killed a second MiG 30 seconds later, then a third at 45 seconds, 3 kills in less than a minute of combat. Then things went wrong. A 4th MiG they hadn't seen, possibly a 5th aircraft that intelligence had missed in the initial count, fired an atoll missile that struck Lodge's Phantom and turned it into a fireball. Locker ejected and spent the next 23 days evading capture in the jungle before a massive rescue operation pulled him out, but Lodge didn't make it. The best Phantom crew in theater had demonstrated what the aircraft could do in the hands of men who understood it completely, but they'd also paid the price that comes with pushing performance to its absolute limit. Beyond Vietnam, the Phantom was proving its worth in conflicts that validated everything McDonnell's engineers had designed into the airframe. When Israel took delivery of its first F-4 ES in 1969, Egyptian and Syrian pilots flying Soviet MiG-21s expected to maintain the qualitative edge they'd enjoyed during the Six-Day War 2 years earlier. Instead, they discovered that Israeli pilots and Phantoms could engage from ranges that made their own tactics irrelevant. During the war of attrition that stretched from 1967 to 1970, Israeli F-4 crews shot down over 100 Arab aircraft while losing only 5 Phantoms to air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of 20 to 1 that shocked Soviet advisors and prompted a complete reevaluation of their tactical doctrine. The turning point came in July 1970, when Israeli Phantoms engaged Soviet pilots flying the latest MiG-21 models in what intelligence had designated as a training mission to assess Israeli capabilities. The Soviet pilots, confident in their superior training and latest equipment, pushed the engagement, expecting to teach the Israelis a lesson about tangling with professional Soviet air power. Instead, Israeli crews shot down 5 MiGs in less than 4 minutes without taking a single hit, sending a diplomatic shockwave through Moscow that contributed to the ceasefire ending the war of attrition. 3 years later, during the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, the Phantom faced its most demanding test when Egypt and Syria launched coordinated surprise attacks that caught Israeli forces unprepared and badly outnumbered. In the first 72 hours, Israeli Phantoms flew missions around the clock, alternating between air superiority sweeps, close air support for ground forces being overrun, and deep strike missions against bridges, airfields, and command centers. The aircraft that critics said was too heavy for sustained combat operations was routinely flying 4 and 5 sorties per day, with some airframes accumulating 15 flight hours in 24-hour periods. Captain Jura Epstein, who would become Israel's highest-scoring ace with 17 confirmed kills, shot down 3 Egyptian MiG-21s in a single engagement on October 18th, then landed, refueled, and launched again 90 minutes later to fly a ground attack mission against Syrian armor threatening Israeli positions in the Golan Heights. When the war ended 19 days after it began, Israeli Phantoms had flown over 11,000 combat sorties and accounted for more than 200 enemy aircraft destroyed, while Arab air forces had managed to shoot down only 33 F-4s despite launching thousands of surface-to-air missiles and committing hundreds of fighters to the battle. What made these victories significant wasn't just the numbers, but what they revealed about the Phantom's design philosophy. Arab pilots flying MiGs weren't inferior or poorly trained. Many had attended Soviet military academies and received instruction from the same cadre that trained Warsaw Pact forces. Their aircraft were modern, capable, and optimized for the kind of close-in turning fights where lighter fighters traditionally held advantages. But they were flying single-mission aircraft designed around specific tactical scenarios, while Israeli crews were flying a weapons system that could adapt to whatever the battle demanded. When Egyptian MiGs tried to bounce Israeli Phantoms at low altitude, the F-4 crews simply lit their afterburners and accelerated away, using superior speed to reset the engagement on their terms. When Syrian aircraft attempted to protect ground forces with combat air patrols, Israeli Phantoms approached from above and behind, using superior radar to detect the enemy first and fire from positions that gave the MiGs no warning and no chance to evade. The multi-role capability that seemed like a compromise in the design phase had become an insurmountable advantage in actual combat, because the Phantom could always choose to fight the battle it would win while avoiding the battles it might lose. American observers watching Israeli success took careful notes, recognizing that their own tactical doctrine needed updates to fully exploit what the Phantom could do when employment wasn't constrained by Vietnam-era rules of engagement and political restrictions. The final chapter of the Phantom's combat career in American service came during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, when F-4G Wild Weasels flew some of the most dangerous missions of the war and proved that even 30-year-old airframes could dominate modern battlefields when flown by crews who understood their purpose. The Wild Weasel mission, suppressing enemy air defenses by hunting and destroying surface-to-air missile sites, is what pilots call a young man's gameplay for keeps, because you're deliberately making yourself a target to draw fire from radar-guided weapons that can kill you from miles away. Air Force Captain Mike Ruff described the experience as flying into a hornet's nest and daring the hornets to sting you. Except these hornets moved at 3 times the speed of sound and carried warheads designed to shred aircraft into confetti. Iraqi air defense crews operating Soviet-made SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 missile systems have been told that American jets would stay high, beyond the range of anti-aircraft guns, which meant radar-guided missiles would be the primary threat. What they didn't know was that wild Weasel crews were using the Phantom's speed and payload capacity to carry AGM-88 HARM missiles that could detect radar emissions from 70 miles away and ride the beam back to its source faster than Iraqi crews could shut down and relocate. On the first night of the air war, January 17, 1991, F-4G Wild Weasels led strike packages into Iraq ahead of the bombers, deliberately activating Iraqi radar systems by flying close enough to force the defenders to lock on or risk letting the strike aircraft through unopposed. The moment an Iraqi radar operator made the fateful decision to track an American jet, Phantom crews had him. HARM missiles would launch automatically, accelerating to over 2,000 miles per hour and following the radar emissions like bloodhounds on a scent trail. Iraqi defenders learned within hours that turning on their radar was suicide, but staying dark meant coalition aircraft could attack at will without fear of surface-to-air missiles. Captain Brett Glazer flew 14 Wild Weasel missions during Desert Storm, and he described the Iraqi dilemma perfectly when he said they had two choices: turn on radar and die immediately, or stay hidden and watch the war happen above them without being able to shoot back. By the end of the first week, Iraqi air defenses had been reduced from one of the densest surface-to-air missile networks in the world to isolated sites that posed nuisance threats but couldn't stop coalition air power from operating with near impunity. The Phantom's final combat missions in American service came in February 1991, just before the ground war began, when Wild Weasel crews flew round-the-clock sorties, ensuring that Iraqi forces would have no air defense coverage when coalition armor crossed the border. Major Randy Goff was flying one of these missions when his Phantom took battle damage from a missile that detonated close enough to pepper the aircraft with shrapnel, but not close enough to bring it down. He described feeling the impact, seeing warning lights illuminate across the instrument panel, and knowing immediately that he was flying a wounded bird that might not make it home. But the Phantom kept flying. The engines kept producing thrust. The hydraulics kept responding to control inputs. Goff nursed the damaged aircraft back to Saudi Arabia, landed safely, and watched maintenance crews count over 60 holes in the wings, fuselage, and tail section. The crew chief told him that any 3 of those hits would have downed a lesser aircraft, but the Phantom had margins built into every system specifically for moments like this. 3 days later, that same airframe was flying combat missions again, patched and ready, proving one final time that the refrigerator with wings was tougher than anything else in the sky. When the last F-4G Wild Weasel retired from active duty in 1996, it marked the end of an era that had seen the Phantom serve in every American conflict from Vietnam through Desert Storm, a service record no other fighter has matched or likely ever will. The legacy of the F-4 Phantom isn't found in museums or airshow performances, though plenty of the 5,800 aircraft built now rest in both places. It's found in the tactical doctrine that governs how modern air forces fight, in the multi-role philosophy that shapes current fighter designs, and in the simple fact that every air superiority aircraft developed since 1960 has been measured against the standard the Phantom established. When the Air Force developed the F-15 Eagle in the 1970s, the design requirements explicitly stated it had to exceed the Phantom's combat record, which meant designers spent thousands of hours studying what made the F-4 successful and building those lessons into the next generation. When the Navy created the F-14 Tomcat, they incorporated the Phantom's emphasis on long-range radar and missile capability while adding the variable geometry wings that would give them the close-in maneuverability Vietnam had revealed as necessary. Even today, when Air Force and Navy pilots train for air combat, they study engagement reports from Phantom crews in Vietnam and Israel, learning the geometry and energy management that turned brute force and speed into dominant advantages against more maneuverable opponents. Perhaps the ultimate vindication of the Phantom's design came from the countries that continued flying it long after American forces had moved on to newer aircraft. Israel flew F-4s until 2004, nearly 50 years after the first prototype took flight, and continued upgrading them with modern avionics and weapon systems because the basic airframe remained so capable that replacing it made no economic sense. Turkey, Greece, South Korea, and Iran all operated Phantoms into the 21st century, and some of those aircraft are still flying today, upgraded with glass cockpits, digital flight controls, and modern radar that would have seemed like science fiction to the crews who flew the original models. Iran, cut off from American spare parts and technical support since 1979, kept a fleet of F-4s operational through a combination of reverse engineering, creative maintenance, and sheer determination, using them in combat during the Iran-Iraq War and maintaining them as frontline fighters into the 2020s. When Iranian engineers were asked why they continued pouring resources into aircraft older than most of their pilots, the answer was simple. Nothing else they could build or buy could carry as much, fly as far, or hit as hard as a properly maintained Phantom. The men who flew the F-4 in combat describe it with a mixture of affection and respect that you don't hear about aircraft that were merely adequate or moderately successful. They talk about the raw power that slammed you back in the seat when you lit both afterburners, the confidence that came from knowing you could always run away if the fight turned bad, and the satisfaction of arriving over a target with enough weapons to do the job right the first time. They remember the sound those J-79 engines made on full military power, a howling scream that announced American presence to everyone within miles and served as both warning and promise. They remember crews who didn't come home, good men lost to missiles and mechanical failures in enemy action, but they also remember victories that changed the course of battles and saved lives on the ground below. When Vietnam veterans gather, when Israeli fighter pilots meet at reunions, when old wild Weasel crews share stories, the Phantom is always there, dominating the conversation because it dominated the sky. The refrigerator with wings that enemy pilots mocked had become the most successful multi-role fighter in history, with a combat record that speaks for itself. 280 confirmed air-to-air kills, 5 million combat flight hours, service in 12 different air forces across 5 continents. The sky belonged to America, and the Phantom made sure everyone knew it.